Assessment course. My name is Jed Cahoon from the University of Wisconsin. And our first course today will start with Amanda Raster, a graduate student here at the University of Wisconsin Madison, who will be talking about some of the sustainability assessment programs that are being used in agriculture or in development today. I'll follow that up with a short piece on how we might put those tools together into a hybridized or tiered approach where we can look at practice and outcome-based approaches to quantifying sustainability at the whole farm level. With that in mind, I'll hand it off to Amanda at this point.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Amanda Raster, and I will be talking about Sustainability Assessment 101, Methods, Tools, and Outcomes. This talk is a product of the research that I've been doing as part of my graduate work with A.J. Busson, Tina Knudsen, and Jeff Wyman here at the University of Wisconsin. So today we'll be covering 4 key areas: methods for addressing sustainability, a comparison of select existing sustainability tools, how you might go about deciding which type of tool you want to use in your sustainability assessment, and then opportunities for harmonizing tools, which I won't go into very much because Jed will be covering that. So actually, let me back up. Before I get into the talk, one of the key questions I think that we need to ask is why do we want to assess sustainability? Does anyone have ideas of why we may want to do that? Oh, they can't. Okay, gotcha. That's right. Okay, so then I'll give you my ideas. So I think it's important to assess sustainability because it helps to create sort of a snapshot of the current state of sustainability for a given agricultural sector. And that's important because you get to see the accomplishments that a certain group has made to date in terms of, you know, whatever you might be looking at: soil erosion, water quality, waste management, pesticide management. But it also helps to identify what the issues and challenges are of making the system more sustainable. It also provides insight into ways to improve farming operations. So again, that kind of goes with the issues and challenges. Once you know what the issues are, then you can begin to identify ways to improve those systems and operations. And then lastly, assessing sustainability promotes research opportunities in sustainable cropping systems. So going back again to the issues and challenges component, there are a lot of research opportunities that can come out of assessing a system or a current operation. So I will be talking about 4 key methods for measuring sustainability, or assessing sustainability rather. The first one is life cycle assessment. The second one is practice-based assessment. Third is process-based assessment. And the last is outcomes and metrics-based assessment. And I'll be defining each of these as I go along. So you don't need to write them all down now. The first one is life cycle assessment. For those of you unfamiliar with life cycle, it's basically a method to assess the environmental impacts associated with a particular product. And it generally encompasses the life of the product from cradle to grave. That's what they like to say. There are 4 key phases of life cycle assessment. The first is the goal and scope. So here is where you're identifying the boundaries of what you want to assess. You're identifying the units that you're assessing. So let's say you work for a dairy association and you want to know the life cycle of cheese. So cheese is your unit, and you're going to set the boundary of the life cycle accordingly. So what are the inputs that go into cheese production, and what are the outputs? The next phase is a life cycle inventory. And this is where you are identifying the flows to and from nature. So if you look at this little chart here, you first identify the input. Well, first identify what the different phases are of the production system. And then for each of those, you identify what the inputs are. And then next, you identify what the outputs are. So this basically creates a map for your life cycle assessment. The next part is the impact assessment. So if you have your map created for the life cycle inventory, and now at each one of those phases or impact areas, you're going to create an assessment of what the impacts are, how you might measure those impacts, and if there are any sort of correlations between the two. And I don't know why there's a red dot on the screen, but there just is. And then the last component is, results interpretation. So this is where you're going to look at the entire assessment that you just did and decide what it means and what you're going to do to improve management practices based on those results. And it helps you identify where you might be more efficient in the production process, where you might create less waste or use alternative inputs to lower your footprint. Generally, life cycle assessment is not used in agriculture. There have been a few instances where it has been done, but the later techniques that I'll be talking about tend to be used more by agriculture. Life cycle assessment tends to be used more by businesses that are creating a product, not necessarily agricultural. So an example of a life cycle assessment is the Sustainability Consortium. This is a project that is being headed by the University of Arkansas, the University of Arizona, and numerous corporations, anything from Walmart to McDonald's to Unilever. A lot of the big players are involved in this initiative. The objective of the Sustainability Consortium is to design and implement science-based measurement and reporting systems for consumer products. So basically, they're creating measurement tools to allow you to assess the footprint of an industry, an entire industry, and then a product. And some of the different industries that they're looking at are food, beverage, and agriculture, electronics, packaging, paper, pulp, forestry. They're really trying to tackle basically all facets of product creation through this work. And what they do is they break it down into two levels. They have a category level. So category is, for agriculture, it could be something like milk or beans. And then they break it down to a product level where it's more specific, like such and such a can of, whatever, name brand. It breaks it down into that level. But their goal here is to create a measurement and reporting system. So they really want to create a standardized set of measurements within each sector and then down to each product. And these tools end up being used by suppliers and groups that buy products along the supply chain. They're not so much used by, speaking from agricultural perspective, they're not so much used by producers at this point. It's really just the people that are buying the product to make sure that their sustainability issues are being addressed. So the next type of assessment is a practice-based assessment. And the example that I'll be talking about is healthy grown potato. A practice-based assessment is where you are incorporating specific practices to improve the sustainability of the particular system that you're looking at. So in this example, healthy grown potato was developed by the Wisconsin Potato and Vegetable Growers Association, the World Wildlife Foundation, and the University of Wisconsin. And the goal was to encourage biologically based pest management, reduce pesticide toxicity, and ecosystem benefits. And the way that they did this was they used research-based practices. Well, they identified different areas that sort of fit into the sustainability of a potato production system. And then they used research-based practices to encourage farmers to adopt sustainable practices. So you can see on the side here, they looked at things like pest management, soil and water quality, They have a natural community standard where they focus on ecosystem restoration for a particular farming operation. And a key component of the Healthy Ground Potato Standard is also that they have a do not use pesticide use, and that relates to their goal to reduce pesticide toxicity. And you can see here in this little clip that, so this is what the standard looks like if you were to open it up. It's broken down into different management sections, and then there's a list of questions that relate to the sustainability of the system. And there are different options for that particular question. So this one, for example, I don't know if you can read it. Which of the following practices did you use prior to planting this year's potato crop to lower the potential for potato disease in the field? And then it gives a number of practices that relate to that question, and each question has a different point value assessed to it. And so the producer will go through the standard and read through the questions and check off whichever practices he or she implements related to that question, and then adds up their points at the end. And if they meet a certain minimum requirement, then they get certification, or they're recognized as certified healthy grown. Oh, and here you can see what the score sheet looks like. So you add up your points for each of the different sections and then have a final score. And you need a minimum score for long season and short season crops to gain sustainability. Another example of a practice-based standard is Food Alliance. They are based out of Portland, Oregon, and they work with a number of different agricultural commodities. Their primary objective is to define and promote sustainability in agriculture and the food industry, and they have a particular focus on safe and fair working conditions, so the social aspects of sustainability, and careful stewardship of the environment. And they have a whole farm standard, which covers all of the common elements of different farming production systems, and they also have crop-specific standards. They have probably, I'm guessing, 60 different crop-specific standards. I just listed a few here as an example. And they also have standards for livestock and farm shellfish. And what's different about Food Alliance compared to Healthy Grown is that there are different levels of points for Food Alliance. So they have a particular question, and then you get different points depending on your increasing sustainability. So for example, this one relates to crop monitoring and field scouting. Level 1 is that crop fields and rangelands are not monitored. Well, you don't get any points for that. But as you go up in levels of the questions, you get more points. And again, on the left side, you can see that, or on the right side, they focus on a lot of the areas that, that Healthy Grown does, and they also have a prohibited pesticide list. But what's different about this is mostly the structure, where it's clear-cut tiers of increasing complexity for sustainability. And then at the end, this is what their final score sheet looks like. You add up again all the points in the particular area. You get 1 point for level 1, 2 points for level 2, and so on. And you don't have to meet a minimum requirement for the standard, but you do have to, actually you do. They say it at the beginning. I didn't make note of that in the slide. But you also have to not practice certain things in order to meet sustainability. So in order to be Food Alliance certified, you cannot use GMO seeds, you can't use antibiotics, you can't use hormones. And that's not very common across a lot of the sustainability standards. And then another key facet of Food Alliance is that they really are open about driving toward continual improvement. So they want farmers to be able to identify when they've improved their cropping system. So the goal is to take this assessment every couple of years, and then the farmer can gauge where he or she improved their practices, and they're better able to recognize how they improved. And yet another example of practice-based, I'll just go through this one really quickly, is the National Soybean Sustainability Initiative. So the two that I talked about previously were more specialty crop focused, and this one is cash grain focused. So this is a collaboration between the United Soybean Board, the American Soybean Association, I believe, and the University of Wisconsin. And the goal for this particular project is to develop a roadmap of soybean management systems that help producers meet sustainability outcomes. And they have a whole farm component that focuses on the commonalities between cash grain production systems, and they also have a soybean-specific tool. And an interesting thing about the National Soybean Initiative, which is also relevant to Healthy Grown, is that it's producer-driven. So there are producers directly involved in this process. They help to identify the types of questions that were included in this tool, what some of the common responses might be, and the components of the tools are all research-based. And then again, you can see on the right side some of the areas that it focuses on, very similar to the two that we previously looked at. But one difference with the National Soybean Sustainability Initiative is that they have more of a focus on economic sustainability than any of the other practice type standards do, which tends to actually be overlooked in a lot of the practice-based assessments. There's a lot of focus on environmental sustainability, a little less focus on social, but not very much focus on economics, which almost suggests that it's really up to the farmer, the producer, to be solely responsible for the economics of their system. So going on to the third type of assessment tool, process-based, I'm using the National Organic Program as an example. Process-based is different than practice-based in that you're looking at the entire process of developing an agricultural product. So instead of focusing on individual practices, like do this, do that, they more focus on the entire production process as a whole, and they have more strict guidelines for what that process is, although they're not really specific practices. So for the National Organic Program, this regulation developed out of the sort of desire to ensure the integrity of products sold as organic, and the scope for the standard is to focus on production, processing, handling, and labeling of organic products. So here's just an example of what some of the questions look like. The key thing about the National Organic Standard, which some of you probably already know, is that you cannot use sewage sludge, synthetic fertilizers, irradiation, or genetically modified materials. And they have a list of approved substances that you can use in your organic production systems, but they tend to not go into specific practices that the grower must include. It's more like an overarching regulation of the production process. And the last type of tool that I'll be talking about is an outcomes or metrics-based tool. And this is where you identify the sustainability goal that you want to meet, and then you develop indicators of how you know that goal was met, like indicators or metrics, so you can measure if the goal was met. And then it's up to whoever adopts that program to implement whatever practices they see fit to meet that goal. So it's different than practice, where practice they actually implement specific practices, and outcomes is where they're trying to reach a specified goal. So the first example of an outcomes-based tool that I'll be talking about is the Field to Market Field Print Calculator. This was developed by the Keystone Center, which is a group that's based in Keystone, Colorado, several national commodity groups, and then numerous ag trade associations. And they wanted to develop a national scale environmental indicator and metrics program. So they're focusing on, right now they have tools for corn, soy, rice, wheat, cotton, and they just recently introduced a tool for potatoes. So the way that the tool works is there is an online calculator where the producer or whoever is using the tool will go in and enter certain production information about land use, energy use, soil loss, irrigation water use, and climate impact. And then the outcome of all of that is that they get this spidergram. And you can see that on each axis is one of the indicator areas, so land use, soil loss, energy use, etc. And the smaller that the little pentagon is to the center means that the impact of that production system is smaller. And the larger it is, the larger the impact. And you can see that, for example, this particular data set generated that there's less sustainability in the area of soil loss than there is compared to, say, land use or climate impact. One thing to note about field to market is that they aggregate local data. So the farmer will input his or her production information into the tool. They'll get a graph, a personal graph for their operation, but then field to market doesn't use a particular farm's information. They aggregate the data to assess whether or not they're meeting particular sustainability goals. The next tool, also metrics-based, is the Stewardship Index for Sustainability, or for Specialty Crops. This was developed by the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Western Growers, and Sure Harvest. And the objective of this program is very similar to the Field to Market Field Print Calculator in that they basically want to measure the sustainability performance of specialty crop supply chains. So again, similar to the field print calculator, the producer will enter production data related to energy use, water use, soil, and nutrient management into the tool. And then so this tool is just a spreadsheet that's available to anyone who wants to use it. And there's a tab in the tool where after you get done entering all your information on separate tabs, then there's a tab that shows the results. And I just focused on one area right here. It'll give you results on energy, nutrients, water, soil, all the metrics that it asks information for. But it will give you basically a quantifiable number for a particular area. So this, for example, potatoes, for fresh market potatoes, this particular grower applied 14.6 pounds of nitrogen per short ton of harvested potato yield. And what this means is that if the farmer were to enter information for the next growing season, that number might change. And so it's basically just a way for growers to see, how their production, or the sustainability of their production system changes from year to year. Oh, I have one more tool. The Outcomes Metrics-Based Cool Farm Tool. So this was developed by the University of Aberdeen, Unilever, and the Sustainable Food Lab. And this tool focuses solely on greenhouse gas emissions from farming operations. So as you can imagine, they only ask questions that relate to the production of greenhouse gas emissions. They ask questions about crop management, field energy use, livestock, sequestration, so carbon sequestration in soils, agricultural product processing, and transport. And so similar to many of the other metrics tools, you enter your production information into the tool, and the outcome that this generates is a little bit different. It will tell you, I did not do that. I don't know what that is. It will tell you the total annual emissions of your farming operation, depending on your production practices, but it also tells you what the source of your greatest emissions is. So if you are a dairy farmer and you have a lot of cows, you might be producing a lot of methane. So it'll tell you that that's your greatest source of emissions. Or maybe your greatest source of emissions comes from pesticides. So it kind of helps you identify the areas of focus for making improvements in your production system. And then it also tells you what the largest GHG compound is in CO2 equivalent. So if methane is your largest source of emissions, then it'll convert that into a carbon dioxide equivalent. I'm not really sure how useful that is to the producer, but that seems to be kind of standard in sustainability measurement is just converting everything to carbon dioxide equivalents. So this chart is a product of my research. I created a database and entered different criteria from all the different tools, and I wanted to see where the most common areas were for sustainability measurement, how many tools address that particular area, and what some of the most common questions were. And I won't go into this chart in any great detail, but you can see just by taking a glance at it that the top 3 categories, soil management, water management, and pest and disease management, they're focused on by most of the standards. I looked at 22, and 19 looked at soil management, 19 looked at water management, 17 looked at pest and disease management, compared to 7 that looked at waste management. So I think that some of the reason that that these particular areas are focused on more than others is that there's more research to back up some of these practices. There's more research in soil management, pest and disease management than there might be in biodiversity. Or alternatively, those things are just easier to quantify than some of the other impact areas. And then this chart shows the social and economic criteria that I looked at. And again, you can see if you compare these numbers, the number of questions to the environmental criteria, there are way fewer questions for some of these areas than there are for environmental. And again, I think this is maybe because social and economics are a little less easy to quantify than environmental. But with economic, again, it's not so much a matter of quantification. I think it's just a matter of standard developers and tool developers don't really want to get into the economics of a farming system. They just kind of want to leave everything up to the farmer, which is good, but sometimes there are ways to manage your farming operation better economically. And if the tool doesn't cover that, then the farmer isn't really privy to that information. And you'll notice if you look at this chart and the social chart, almost all of the areas ask for some sort of documentation of the practices, which has actually been a bit of an issue in getting producers to adopt some of these tools because they don't necessarily want to share their information without knowing that it's completely protected. And this might be something that you'll run into as you develop your tools this semester. It's just something to keep in mind. And then this chart shows, so this is a product of the second part of my research, which was collecting production data from the 9 potato farms in Wisconsin and entering it into 6 different potato tools. I left one of them out because it didn't fit neatly in with these categories here. So there's five tools here, and so across the top right here are the different tools, and then on this column right here, it's the different impact areas that the tools address. So you can see, again, soil and water management, or soil and nutrient management, water management, and pesticide management are really the key areas that the tools focus on. All of the tools that I've looked at to compare production data, or to compare the tools using production data, ask questions about these 3 areas. For biodiversity, there's only one tool that addresses biodiversity, and again, for financial management, there are 2. So you can kind of see some general themes across the tools as to what they focus on and what they don't. So this gets us to the question of which tools are you going to use this semester when you develop your tools. What kind of approach are you going to take? I think the first question that you might want to ask is, what are you trying to accomplish? Do you want growers to implement best management practices that are backed up by research and that you know will, or you hope will, improve the sustainability of a particular system? Or do you want them to meet specific outcomes or specific goals? So if your goal is for a particular production group or producer group to improve water quality, then you'll set standards for water quality and allow the producer to implement whatever practices to meet that goal. You'll also want to ask yourself what kinds of data are available. Do the farms keep data, like qualitative data or quantitative data on what they do? A lot of times they just have a general production plan where it's all qualitative, and so you can't, it's harder to translate that information into a tool. If they have quantitative data, then you're able to actually do some measurements on outcomes and specify goals. And then you might also want to ask what types of tools already exist for the crop sector that you're working with. And then lastly, given the types of tools that exist, the broad range and the various purposes, are there opportunities to integrate them? And again, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about this because Jed's going to be going into it more. But I think that the opportunities of integrating practice-based assessments with outcomes measurement tools are great. One of the reasons why you might want to do this is because it would allow you to measure the more quantitative outcomes of implementing specific best management practices, so you can see if what you're doing is actually contributing to a specified outcome. And it also helps farmers to better interpret results and modify management practices. So if they can see how certain practices are contributing to a goal or an outcome, then they're better able to modify their management systems to improve where they see fit. So just in summary, we talked about why sustainability assessment is important. There are research opportunities involved. It creates a snapshot of the current state of sustainability for a particular sector. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that it also serves as a communication tool where you can tell other links in the supply chain what you're doing and what you plan to work on. The method of assessment that you choose will depend on your goals. You can be looking at the same farms, have the same data, and you'll get a different output depending on the type of tool that you use. So that's something to keep in mind. And as we saw from the charts that I showed, there's considerable overlap in impact areas and the types of questions asked across the tools. So one thing to consider is how do you reduce redundancy so that it's not burdensome to the grower to fill out yet another tool. And then we also briefly talked about opportunities for tool integration as a way of allowing the farmer to better assess the outcomes of implementing practices. And that's it.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Great overview of all the sustainability assessment options that are currently out there or in development today. I'd like to spend just a few minutes as we close today's recording talking about a hybrid or tiered approach to sustainability assessment. So as Amanda described, there are many different options out there. How would we choose depending on which commodity or region we might be producing in? What I might suggest and what we've done some work on recently is whether the option of a hybrid or tiered approach could get to the best of all worlds with these assessment programs. I'd like to spend just a few minutes describing to you why we would be interested in that and maybe a way forward that's worth looking into. First, to build upon what Amanda described towards the end of her presentation, there are a lot of challenges in these sustainability assessments. I'll cover just a few here in introduction. First of all, the one-size-fits-all approach will not likely work. There are regional differences within a commodity. A great example would be strawberry production in the United States. In the upper Midwest and northeastern United States, strawberries are grown as a perennial crop. In the southeastern United States and Southwest, they're grown often as annuals on plasticulture, plastic mulch. It's a very, very different production system, even though the end product is the same. We would have the same differences if we were to compare fresh versus processed foods or the scale at which they're grown. So a lot of regional differences within a commodity. That doesn't mean that one way is better than the other. It just means that it's done differently. And that's hard to capture in a one-size-fits-all approach. And then we have to look at the differences among commodities, which is vast. Growing strawberries, even on the same farm as one of our speakers last week described to you, alongside soybeans is very, very different. So that can be difficult in a single assessment tool to find the one-size-fits-all. Most importantly, though, as many producers have pointed out to us, few farms produce just one commodity. And actually, an integrated farm may be the most sustainable. We've heard about integrating livestock and row crop agriculture, for example, and the ability to use the manure from livestock production as a more sustainable nutrient input for the row crop production. It's a great system, but how do we look at all the different potential combinations of what one might produce behind the farm gate and put it into a tool that can be reasonable in length to be able to capture that variability that makes farming so interesting? The number one sustainability challenge by far, I think those that have been involved in this for several years would agree, is producer engagement. If you go down to the bottom of the slide, I think we can get to the crux of that really. Sustainability assessment is a voluntary and not regulatory process. And those behind the farm gate and many others agree that it should stay that way. If you know the background on the National Organic Program, which is now regulated primarily by USDA, that program started out as a voluntary certification program. It really was very analogous to what Amanda described to you with the many, many different sustainability assessment programs that you might use today. There were several groups going after the same endpoint in different ways, and it became very confusing on what they were actually offering in the organic program, and therefore USDA has encompassed it all into the National Organic Program in a more regulated way. Those involved in sustainability assessment understandably don't want to do that, but a voluntary program can be really difficult to stimulate engagement, especially when the producer's not getting paid anymore to participate. They may simply be getting market access at that point. The other concerns in terms of producer engagement, and Dina will cover more of these in upcoming webinars, the full spectrum of knowledge and interest in sustainability exists out there in the producer community, from folks that have no interest in participating whatsoever and have no interest in the topic to a much smaller percentage that are very highly interested in driving their production areas forward. Data security, invasiveness, and timely issues we hear quite often. The data security issue is a question of whether that information that's provided could be accessed by others that could do harm to that producer or production operation. So for example, for us working in the public area, there could be a public records request of data from a producer should we bring that information in through a sustainability assessment program. We work around that in many ways, such as allowing the producer association to own the data that's shared with us anonymously in that case. Some of the questions that Amanda described are often found as invasive, especially when we get into some of the outcomes or when economic considerations are asked in the questioning. So that can drive away some of the producers that may be involved in these programs. And finally, the timeliness issues. Some of these larger sustainability assessment programs can take multiple days to fill out. And when there isn't a value added or direct value in payment based on participation, it can be really difficult to convince somebody that's something you want to do. So the number one challenge by far in all of these programs is producer engagement, getting a reasonable number of producers to the table to be involved, that statistically that data could hold up and be worth analyzing at that point. Amanda covered this a little bit, but practices versus outcomes I think is really where a lot of these sustainability assessments hit heads. A few simple considerations when you consider practices versus outcomes. Does the research support the relationship between practices and outcomes? So for example, we know that reduced tillage research supports that that may reduce soil erosion. So the practice of reducing tillage supports the outcome of reduced erosion. That can be very difficult to delineate, though, and in many cases, the literature may be mixed on reporting of the practices and the relationship, positive or negative, to an outcome. So that can be, again, a regional and commodity specific piece there in that relationship of the practice and the outcome. How cumbersome, expensive, or invasive is the outcome data collection? That's what this really comes down to in a voluntary approach where there isn't direct market value for producer participation. Does the outcome run on a meter, such as electricity? A lot of the interest in quantifying sustainability or assessing sustainability came from industrial sustainability, where things have roofs and they run on meters. Electricity, gas, water. It's as simple as looking at a utility bill and reporting back on it. We don't have good meters for a lot of the pieces of agriculture that people are interested in, soil health, community involvement, and such. So that can be very difficult to quantify. Another great example would be biodiversity. It's extremely difficult to quantify. Is there liability associated with reporting the outcomes, such as water quality? That would have some direct implication and liability to the actual producer by reporting that information. And finally, is it expensive or extremely challenging to quantify at the farm level? There's a lot of interest right now in soil health. It's very poorly defined even, so it's difficult to quantify something for which you don't have a solid definition. So I think we need to look at the expense involved in quantifying some of these at the farm level. To get around that, some of these sustainability assessments have taken more of a high altitude approach, and they quantify aspects such as water quality at a landscape or a watershed level. But how does that directly relate to behind the farm gate when you have a diverse number of producers out there on the landscape? So one approach that we might take would be a hybrid approach. There are a few outcomes that are quantified that are reasonably captured and where change can be documented and reported over time. Fuel use in farming, for example. Every producer can tell you how much fuel they purchased in the past year. They pay that bill, and they know exactly how much they've used in that case. So it may be something where it's reasonable to look at fuel use and whether there may be advancements over time that can be captured by simply looking at the bill when fuel is delivered. The other aspect of that, though, would be where outcomes are unreasonable. Practices that support positive outcomes are surveyed in a way that is defended by peer-reviewed science. So if you can't take the utility bill and report back on it, that's when we have to look at the literature and decide, is there enough evidence that supports that outcome based on the practices that are implemented, and look at a way that you might combine the few simple outcomes with the rest of those quantified through practices. The other way to look at it, so that's the hybrid practice outcome approach. The other way to look at it is a tiered approach where we look at producer participation, keeping in mind that some producers have a high level of interest in this topic and are reasonably engaged. Others that are looking at other aspects of their production outside of sustainability, and this really isn't a point of emphasis for them. How can we capture the waterfront so that maybe those that are involved in self-assessment surveys that are practice-based, that data can be used to look at the relationship to the outcomes with a much smaller tier of producer participation. So if we start in the pyramid diagram at the bottom, maybe it would be reasonable that 70% of producers of a particular commodity would be involved in an introductory practice-based self-assessment survey. That may be a voluntary starting point for sustainability education, just to get the word out there about sustainability in some of the self-assessments, but not to create an overly cumbersome or invasive program. And there are a lot of commodities and regions that are going down that road where the self-assessment survey may be as short as 20 questions, just to get it out there as a primer on sustainability, and maybe 70% of the producers could be reasonably expected within a certain commodity to be involved in that base approach. The next level up would be a hybrid approach, outcome and practice-based self-assessment. The survey tool would have random error around it, but there would be no auditing. Maybe 25% of the producers would be willing to participate in that. When you're surveyed at home through phone survey or paper survey and such, you're never audited after that. This would be a similar type approach where maybe folks would be willing to participate if they knew somebody wouldn't be knocking on the door asking to see where those numbers came from. The next higher tier in the hybrid approach would be an outcome and practice-based approach with random auditing. We feel that the expectation for that may be 4% of a producer population might be willing to participate in that approach, and out of that 4% of the producer population participating, maybe only 5% are audited. And there are other assessment programs right now, especially as they relate to export commodities such as soybean and corn for ethanol production that are being exported. The programs that they're involved in require some level of auditing. And that seems to have been an approach that's reasonable for those looking at that particular export market. And the top tier would be the outcome-based approach, some of which Amanda described to you today. Obviously, it's a lot more time-consuming. In LCA, for example, one of the producers recently suggested to me that it took about 3 days to go through that process. Maybe only 1% of the producers have enough interest in this approach to be able to participate. But the idea would be through this tiered approach, we could relate each tier level of participation to see if the practices support the outcomes at the highest tier that maybe only 1% are participating in, but they're supported by the rest of the grower population. So this is one option that we've been bouncing around and may be useful as we move forward in assessing sustainability in a way that we can reasonably engage a larger producer population without being invasive, expensive, or overly cumbersome in that approach. So how do we get there? First, a common set of guiding principles regardless of commodity. In our case, we're working through this National Initiative for Sustainable Agriculture, of which a producer group got together to establish the guiding principles, of which most importantly, it's producer-led. The producers are at the table designing the guiding principles and deciding what sustainability assessments are reasonable behind the farm gate. Number two, it's science-based. There's research to support the actions moving forward. There are other guiding principles that we can direct you to on the NISA website, but we need a common foundation from which we're engaging producers regardless of commodity. The second piece would be a warehouse of sustainability assessment tools, starting with a whole farm base module. Amanda very nicely described that in her approach. One piece that we can't do is keep asking producers the same questions over and over to comply with different assessment tools. I found in recent years that working with groups from cranberries through the processing vegetables and now soybeans and others, it seems that many of these questions are in common no matter what you're producing, and you can maybe get 90% of the waterfront and sustainability covered through one whole farm base module. And then maybe we look at approaches that we add on commodity-specific pieces moving forward. A suite of voluntary validation options, whether that be the self-assessment and reporting of a larger population or the auditing of a very small grower population that we described earlier. We need appropriate linkages between those tiers of engagement so that each tier is validated by that above it that has a smaller grower population involved in it, and we talked about that in the tiered pyramid approach. And finally, we need harmonized supply chain communications. If we were able to go with a hybrid or tiered approach with producer communities, would that satisfy what the supply chain is asking for in terms of sustainability? And by doing so, we would be able to engage the producers in a reasonable way, but also deliver on what the supply chain is asking for. And that requires a harmonized line of communication from the field to the fork. So that's one of the approaches that each of these pieces of how do we get there will build on over the webinars in the next several weeks. And we'd ask that you might join on each of those weeks so that you can see how we would propose to put all of those steps together to develop a sustainability assessment program. And with that, I will complete this webinar for this week. We look forward to you joining us in future recordings. And we'll take any questions that you might have at this point.